The Dead Man's Chair. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The wind howled through the trees as the old house creaked and groaned under the pressure of the storm. For years, it had sat abandoned on the outskirts of town, a forgotten relic of another time, with its broken windows and rotting timbers. But tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself were waiting for something or someone. Henry had never been superstitious. He was a man of reason, of facts, and he didn't believe in ghosts or curses. So when his old friend, Robert, had passed away and left him the house, he didn't think twice about it. Robert had always spoken of the place with a kind of reverence, warning him of the house's strange history, but Henry had dismissed it as old man ramblings. It was just a house, after all. A house that would surely make him a fortune once he cleaned it up and sold it. As he stepped through the doorway, a chill crawled up his spine. The smell of decay and dust hit him instantly, mixing with the damp scent of the storm outside. The furniture was covered in thick sheets, and the walls were adorned with faded wallpaper that seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. There were cracks in the ceiling, water stains on the floor, and dust in every corner. But there, in the center of the room, stood a chair. It was a large, imposing piece of furniture, upholstered in a dark, worn leather. The kind of chair that seemed to demand attention, its armrests shaped like claws. Its presence was overpowering, almost unnatural, as if it belonged to someone or something who had never left. Henry set down his bag and walked toward the chair, drawn to it in a way he couldn't explain. As he reached out to touch it, a sudden rush of cold air blew through the room, making the hair on his neck stand up. He hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged it off. It was just the storm, the wind playing tricks on him. He sat down in the chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. For a moment, he felt an odd sensation, as though the chair were adjusting itself to fit him perfectly. The feeling passed quickly, and he looked around the room again, wondering what had brought him here. It was strange, he could almost hear Robert's voice in his head, warning him to leave. But Robert was gone, and Henry had no reason to listen to those old warnings. Still, the unease gnawed at him, like something was just out of reach, something he couldn't quite grasp. He stood up abruptly, shaking the thought from his mind. He needed to get to work. There was cleaning to do, repairs to make, and he wasn't going to let a chair or a feeling stop him. But as he moved to leave the room, a strange sound stopped him in his tracks. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. He turned back toward the chair, his heart beginning to race. The sound was unmistakable now, a voice, clear and urgent, calling his name. H. Henry. He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was unmistakably Robert's, but it was distorted, as if coming from a great distance. And it was getting louder, closer. "Don't sit in the chair," the voice whispered, urgent and pleading. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He glanced back at the chair, his stomach churning. He had just sat in it, hadn't he? The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a new thought struck him. What if Robert's warnings had been real? What if this was all a mistake? He shook his head, trying to rationalize the feeling of dread that was creeping over him. It was just his mind playing tricks, surely. But something inside him urged him to leave, to never look back. He turned to leave, but the chair seemed to beckon him back. He tried to ignore it, but his legs wouldn't listen. He found himself walking toward it again, as if drawn by an invisible force. The voice grew louder, now a desperate, guttural rasp. "Don't sit in the chair, Henry. It's not just a chair. It's where he waits. He'll take you." He reached the chair, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, as if invisible eyes were upon him. The air felt thick, suffocating. The whispering continued, louder and more frantic. "Leave. Before it's too late." But it was too late. Henry felt a sudden pressure on his chest, as if a weight were pressing down on him. He couldn't breathe. He gasped, trying to stand, but his legs were frozen in place. His vision blurred, and he struggled to make sense of what was happening. The chair. The chair was pulling him in. It was no longer just a piece of furniture, it was something alive, something with a terrible presence that seemed to stretch into the very bones of the house. Henry's body jerked, and he stumbled forward, his hands grabbing onto the armrests for support. He felt a coldness, a presence behind him. And then, a voice, low and deep, whispered in his ear, so close that he could feel the breath on his neck. "Welcome home." A scream ripped from his throat as he tried to break free, but it was too late. The chair seemed to grip him, its arms tightening around him like iron shackles. The air was filled with a cold, unnatural chill, and the room began to spin. The shadows lengthened, twisting into dark shapes that seemed to move on their own. And then the figure appeared. It was a man, or what had once been a man, dressed in old, tattered clothing. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, like hollow pits, but it was Robert. Or what had been Robert. His mouth was twisted in a grotesque grin, and his hands were outstretched, reaching for Henry. Henry struggled against the chair, but it was no use. The leather seemed to come alive, gripping him tighter with every movement. The more he fought, the more it seemed to pull him in, drawing him closer to the figure that stood before him. "You shouldn't have come," Robert's voice rasped, no longer the warm, familiar tone of his old friend, but something darker, something unnatural. "Now you're part of this place. You're part of the curse." Henry's vision blurred again, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into shadows. The figure loomed closer, and Henry could feel the coldness spreading, seeping into his skin, his bones. It was all happening too quickly, too fast. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The room was silent again. The shadows hung motionless, and the coldness faded, leaving only an oppressive stillness. Henry's chest heaved, and he realized with a start that he was no longer in the chair. He was lying on the floor, his hands gripping the cold wood beneath him. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Had it all been a hallucination? Had he imagined it? He looked around the room, and everything seemed normal, too normal. But then he saw it. The chair. It was still there, in the center of the room. But now, it was different. The leather was no longer worn. The arms were no longer simply shaped wood. They were flesh-cold, pale flesh. And in the center of the seat, there was a bloody handprint. A fresh, dark stain that seemed to pulse, beating like a heart. And then, from the corner of the room, he heard it again. "Welcome home, Henry." The door slammed shut, trapping him inside. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he would never leave. Not alive. Not ever again. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the chair, his eyes never leaving it. The bloody handprint on the seat seemed to glow with an eerie, pulsing light, as though it were alive, beating with a life of its own. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the darkness of the room seemed to press in around him, making the walls close in with every passing second. The whispering voices had returned, low and guttural, circling him like a swarm of invisible insects, urging him to stay, to sit, to surrender. "Henry." The voice of Robert called again, this time with a sinister, mocking tone. "You can't escape. The chair. It won't let you." Henry felt the weight of those words crash down on him like a physical blow. His mind screamed at him to move, to get out, but his feet were glued to the floor. He could almost feel the chair pulling him back, as if some invisible force was slowly reeling him toward it. The sense of dread in the room was overwhelming, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He turned away, eyes frantic as he searched for an escape, a way out, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the door nowhere in sight. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the house with each gust, but the room itself was unnervingly still. It was as if time had frozen, the outside world no longer existing, leaving him trapped in this dark, suffocating place. With his heart pounding in his chest, Henry stumbled toward the far wall, his fingers grazing the peeling wallpaper, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Was this a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by grief or fear? But the coldness that crawled under his skin, the pressure in the air, felt all too real. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. The house was alive. And it wanted him. The chair groaned, as if in protest, its leather creaking and cracking like the sound of bones snapping. Henry's gaze snapped back to it. The armrests, once solid and worn, now appeared to move, to flex, like the fingers of some monstrous creature. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural energy, like the chair was drawing power from the very fabric of the room. He tried again to move, his body fighting against the urge to go toward it. But his legs felt like lead. The more he struggled, the stronger the pull became, as though the chair itself was calling to him, beckoning him like a siren's song. "No." Henry gasped, his voice strained and desperate. "I want tea." A loud crack split the air, and Henry was thrown to the ground. His body collided with the wooden floor, his limbs bruising and aching, but the pain was nothing compared to the cold terror that gripped his chest. He looked up just in time to see the chair lurch forward, its leather arms twisting and stretching, as though alive. The dark, hollow eyes of Robert's figure loomed over him, filling his vision, blocking out everything else. The figure's face had changed, its features warped into something unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of the man he once knew. Robert's mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, the skin around it cracking and peeling, revealing something beneath something dark and pulsating. His voice was no longer the familiar one Henry had once known, but a deep, guttural rasp that sent chills down his spine. "Do you see now?" the figure growled, his voice echoing with a sinister resonance. "The chair has chosen you, just as it chose me. You belong to it now, Henry. You'll sit, and you'll never leave." Henry tried to scramble away, but his limbs were weak, as if the very air in the room was draining his strength. He turned, his eyes darting frantically around for something, anything that could save him. But there was nothing. The door was still gone, the room seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the chair was closer than ever, looming over him like a predator. His breath caught in his throat as he realized he was trapped. The whispers were louder now, overlapping, a chorus of voices that once were, or perhaps still were, people who had sat in the chair before him. They had all been claimed, just as Robert had been, just as he would be. There was no escape. Not from the chair. Not from the house. A low, almost musical sound began to hum through the air, an eerie, hypnotic tune that seemed to originate from the chair itself. It reverberated in his skull, pulling him in, drawing him closer. His hands shook violently as he pushed against the floor, trying to crawl away, but the sound became louder, more insistent. Henry's head spun. He couldn't think clearly. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an unseen force. His hands were shaking so badly that they couldn't find purchase on the floor. And then he heard it, the voice again. Closer this time. "Sit, Henry." His body moved of its own accord, jerking toward the chair. He fought it with everything he had, but his limbs betrayed him. The world spun, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls closing in with terrifying speed. He felt his legs bending, his body collapsing, his hands reaching out instinctively toward the armrests. "No! No!" he screamed, but the words were drowned out by the overwhelming sound, the humming that seemed to resonate in his very bones. He was almost there, the cold leather against his fingertips, and as his hands closed around the armrests, he felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through his body, like electricity coursing through his veins. The chair was alive. With a final, desperate scream, Henry was pulled into the chair. His body was forced down into the seat, his back arching painfully as something cold and unyielding wrapped around him, locking him in place. The leather seemed to tighten, the armrests curling around his wrists like iron chains. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The pain, the cold, the pressure, it was all consuming. From the corner of his eye, he saw Robert's twisted figure step closer, his grin widening until it was almost too much to bear. His hollow eyes burned with a malevolent hunger. "You're one of us now," Robert whispered, his voice a low rasp, full of satisfaction. "You'll sit forever. You'll never leave. Not until the next one comes." Henry opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, and the room around him began to dissolve, fading into darkness. The last thing he saw was Robert's face, grinning, as the chair pulled him deeper, into the cold, suffocating darkness of the house. And then, there was nothing. The storm raged outside, but inside the house, all was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old timbers and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of leather groaning under pressure. The chair remained in the center of the room, dark, waiting. And on its worn, leather seat, there was a new handprint, bloody and fresh. The end.